The investigation into the high school massacre is slow-moving and dangerous. The two gunmen who went on the rampage booby-trapped the building and even themselves.
And we were there for what seemed like an eternity, and then chaos kind of erupted. One of my best friends came out and said, "Mandy, we have to go. They're shooting." And I said, "Who's shooting?"
People were getting shot all around me.
Children were running from the school at breakneck speeds, and I knew that the world had changed.
On the morning of April 20th, 1999, two students entered Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, armed with guns, homemade explosives, and a plan to inflict mass violence. Within 49 minutes, 13 people were dead, 12 students, and 1 teacher. Over 20 more were injured. The shooters, both seniors at the school, ended the rampage by taking their own lives in the library. It was, at the time,
a bullet entered the side of my backpack.
The deadliest school shooting in U.S. history. But its impact didn't stop there. Columbine didn't just change the lives of survivors or the town of Littleton, it changed the entire nation. It changed how schools approached safety and security. It changed how policymakers and citizens debated gun laws. And it changed how the media, law enforcement, and the public understood the warning signs of targeted school violence. For many Americans, Columbine marked the end of an era of perceived safety in schools.
All day long, investigators have searched the homes of both teenage killers. In one of them, police say they found bomb-making materials.
Terms like lockdown drills, active shooter protocols, and zero-tolerance policies became part of everyday vocabulary in education. And for a generation of students, Columbine became a reference point.
I'm doing an interview right now. You've got one male party in a black trench coat, one in a white shirt, shotguns that are being fired towards a hill. They were launching grenades on top of the roof.
A moment when the threat of school violence stopped being theoretical and became frighteningly real. This is the story of the Columbine shooting. What happened, how the country responded, and why its effects are still being felt in classrooms and communities across America, more than 2 decades later. On the morning of April 20th, 1999, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, seniors at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, initiated a meticulously planned attack that would become one of the most infamous school shootings in U.S. history. 11:10 a.m. Harris and Klebold arrive at Columbine High School in separate vehicles. 11:14 a.m. They entered the school cafeteria and placed 2 duffel bags containing propane bombs, each set to detonate at 11:17 a.m. 11:17 a.m., the bombs failed to explode as planned. 11:19 a.m., the pair began shooting students outside the school before moving inside. 11:35 a.m., within approximately 16 minutes, they had killed 12 students and 1 teacher, and wounded over 20 others. 12:08 p.m., Harris and Klebold committed suicide in the school library. The entire attack lasted less than an hour, but left a lasting impact on the nation. The victims included 12 students: Cassie Bernal, Stephen Curnow, Corey DePuter, Kelly Fleming, Matthew Ketchter, Daniel Mouser, Daniel Rohrbo, Rachel Scott, Isaiah Scholes, John Tomlin, Lauren Townsend, and Kyle Velasquez. 1 teacher, William Dave Sanders, who was credited with saving many students before being fatally shot. Additionally, over 20 individuals were injured, some critically. One of the injured, Anne-Marie Hochhalter, who was paralyzed during the attack, died in 2025 from complications related to her injuries, bringing the official death toll to 14. Harris and Klebold were armed with firearms, including a Hi-Point 995 carbine, Savage 67H pump-action shotgun, Intratec TEC DC-9, and Stevens 311D double-barreled sawed-off shotgun. Explosives. They had constructed multiple propane bombs and pipe bombs, many of which failed to detonate. Their intent was to cause maximum casualties through the initial explosions, followed by shooting targeting survivors. The Police response to the Columbine shooting was later criticized for delays in entering the building and engaging the shooters.
Found their first pipe bomb in the parking lot, and the Denver bomb squad immediately sealed off the building. Robotic cameras later found the entire school was booby-trapped.
At the time, standard protocol was to secure the perimeter and wait for specialized units. This approach was reevaluated in the aftermath, leading to the development of the immediate action, rapid deployment tactic for active shooter situations. The Columbine High School shooting sent shockwaves across the United States. It was not the first school shooting in the country, but it was the most devastating at that point in terms of planning, execution, and psychological impact.
The side of my backpack spun around and actually shot me in the back and shot out my right hip. And at that moment, I lost my legs completely.
News of the attack broke quickly, and within hours, images of students fleeing the school, SWAT teams surrounding the perimeter, and parents anxiously waiting outside were broadcast nationwide. The sheer brutality and premeditation of the attack stunned the public. The shooters had planned the attack for over a year. They had recorded videos known as the basement tapes where they detailed their intentions. Their motives remained murky, sparking intense debate about bullying, mental health, and youth culture. In the immediate aftermath, the town of Littleton became a focal point in national mourning. Memorials were held across the country. School communities everywhere began asking difficult questions about their own preparedness and safety. Columbine became a media phenomenon.
Parents, hug your kids. Pray that be happy. It could happen in a second that they'll be gone.
Continuous coverage dominated the news cycle for weeks. While the media helped raise awareness about school violence, it also contributed to confusion and, at times, misinformation. Early reports inaccurately emphasized connections to specific social cliques and speculated about motives that were never fully substantiated. This fueled stereotypes and increased public anxiety. The case also triggered widespread scrutiny of pop culture. Violent video games such as Doom were heavily criticized. Music by artists like Marilyn Manson was blamed, despite a lack of direct connection. The internet, still in its early public stages, was examined as a possible influence on the perpetrator's thinking. The attack shook parents, educators, and students nationwide. School no longer felt like a guaranteed safe space. Discussions quickly turned to how can this happen, and what can be done to prevent it from happening again. Columbine forced schools and communities to confront a new reality. Mass violence could erupt, not just in cities or war zones, but in quiet suburban towns, and it could come from within. It marked the beginning of a shift in how America viewed school safety, youth mental health, and the potential for violence in the places once considered most secure. In the months and years following Columbine, school districts across the United States began to dramatically revise their approach to campus safety. The attack had exposed major gaps in preparedness and response, and it forced both school administrators and lawmakers to act. One of the most immediate changes was the increase in on-campus security presence. Schools began hiring school resource officers, law enforcement professionals stationed on school grounds full-time, private security contractors, particularly in urban districts. Alongside personnel changes, school invested in security infrastructure. Video surveillance systems were installed in hallways, entrances, and parking lots. Electronic entry systems and ID badges became standard in many schools, restricting open access to campus buildings. Metal detectors, though not universal, were introduced in schools considered high risk. Columbine changed how schools prepare for crisis situations. Before 1999, most schools had fire drills and perhaps occasional lockdown procedures. After Columbine, active shooter drills became a regular part of student and staff training. Lockdown drills were introduced to prepare for intruders or armed threats. Shelter-in-place protocols were established for different emergency scenarios. Collaboration with local law enforcement became essential. Many schools now coordinate drills directly with police and emergency services. Additionally, schools began developing crisis communication systems to alert parents and coordinate with first responders during emergencies. At the policy level, schools adopted zero-tolerance policies for weapons, threats, and violent behavior. These policies, while controversial, were designed to send a strong message: threats would not be ignored. Many schools also introduced anonymous reporting systems for students to share concerns about peers. Threat assessment teams, often made up of counselors, teachers, and administrators tasked with evaluating potential risks. Mental health support staff, including school psychologists and counselors, were added or expanded in many districts. In some cases, these reforms led to over-policing or heightened anxiety, particularly in communities of color. However, the general trend after Columbine was toward greater vigilance, faster response times, and a layered approach to school safety. Columbine didn't just change policies, it changed culture. Students growing up after 1999 came of age in schools where security cameras, drills, and locked doors were the norm, not the exception. The message was clear: school safety could no longer be assumed. It had to be designed, implemented, and constantly reviewed. In the wake of the Columbine massacre, national attention turned sharply toward gun laws, specifically how two teenagers were able to amass an arsenal of weapons and ammunition. Despite the public outcry, major federal gun control reforms did not materialize in the immediate aftermath. Instead, debates intensified, dividing lawmakers and the public on how best to balance Second Amendment rights with public safety. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were both underage and obtained their firearms through third-party purchases. Two of the guns were purchased at a gun show by a friend of the shooters who later admitted she knew the weapons were for them. These sales bypassed background checks, exploiting what became known as the gun show loophole, a gap in the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act that allowed private sellers to sell firearms without a background check. This revelation became a central focus of gun reform advocates. In 1999, the U.S. Senate passed legislation to close the gun show loophole and expand background checks. However, the measure failed in the House of Representatives, and no comprehensive federal law followed. At the state level, some changes occurred. Colorado passed laws requiring background checks for all gun sales, including those at gun shows. Several other states introduced or strengthened laws around firearms access and child safety. But nationally, momentum stalled. The political climate and the influence of pro-gun organizations like the National Rifle Association made it difficult to build consensus on stricter regulations. As gun reform efforts faced gridlock, more energy was directed toward improving school security and emergency response, a less politically divisive approach. This shift reflected a broader trend. After Columbine, the focus moved away from preventing gun access and toward responding more effectively when violence occurs. Columbine became a symbol in the gun control debate. For gun safety advocates, it represented the urgent need to reform. For gun rights supporters, it underscored the need for armed self-defense and school protection. Though federal policy change was limited, Columbine laid the groundwork for future movements, including those led by survivors of later shootings such as Sandy Hook and Parkland. It also helped catalyze a generation of activists and students who began to see school safety as inseparable from gun legislation, a connection that continues to shape debates today. The violence at Columbine High School left deep psychological scars, not only on the direct victims and survivors, but on the entire community of Littleton, and eventually the nation at large. In the days after the shooting, counselors and crisis response teams flooded the school district to help students, teachers, and families process the trauma. Many survivors reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, panic attacks, anxiety, and emotional numbness. Teachers who were caught in the crossfire or tried to protect students struggled with survivors' guilt and long-term stress. Parents faced the unimaginable task of either mourning their children or helping them cope with witnessing death and violence firsthand. The library, where 10 of the 13 murders took place, was completely demolished and rebuilt, as the trauma associated with that space was overwhelming for students and staff. Littleton became a center of mourning and recovery. Vigils, memorial services, and public tributes were held for the victims. A permanent Columbine Memorial was established in Clement Park near the school, designed with input from victims' families, survivors, and community members. Annual remembrance events continue, often focused not just on grief, but on messages of hope and prevention. For many survivors, the trauma didn't end with high school. Some faced long-term mental health challenges, including depression, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse. Others became advocates for gun reform, school safety, or youth mental health, using their experiences to educate and push for change. The parents of several victims launched foundations, including those focused on nonviolence education, mental health awareness, and youth outreach. Columbine also helped schools and governments recognize the need for on-site mental health professionals, crisis intervention training for staff, and long-term support plans for communities affected by school violence. In the broader public, Columbine contributed to a greater awareness of the importance of identifying early signs of emotional distress in students, the need for peer support programs and accessible counseling, impact of trauma on learning and behavior in school settings. The psychological legacy of Columbine continues to influence how schools approach emotional well-being today. For many survivors, coping is a lifelong journey, and sharing their stories has become a key part of how they process and heal. Columbine left behind more than grief. It left behind a profound legacy that continues to shape school policy, emergency preparedness, law enforcement tactics, and national discourse around gun violence. In the years after the attack, a troubling trend emerged. Columbine became a point of reference, and for some, a blueprint. Subsequent school shooters referenced Harris and Klebold directly, sometimes attempting to emulate their tactics. The term Columbine effect came to describe the phenomenon where media attention and cultural mythology surrounding the shooters inspired others to carry out similar attacks. This led to new conversations about how the media covers mass shootings, particularly the risks of sensationalizing perpetrators. As a result, some advocacy groups and news outlets began adopting policies to avoid naming shooters or focusing on their motives, an effort to reduce notoriety and discourage copycat crimes. Columbine marked a turning point in police response to active shooters. Before 1999, standard practice was to secure the perimeter and wait for SWAT. After Columbine, law enforcement agencies began training officers in immediate action rapid deployment, entering buildings quickly to stop shooters as fast as possible. This shift fundamentally changed how schools and police train for emergencies. Columbine also changed how schools talk about safety, trauma, and violence. Lockdown drills became routine. Threat assessment protocols were adopted nationally. Anti-bullying campaigns, school climate initiatives, and student reporting tools were introduced. While many of these changes had been discussed prior to 1999, Columbine accelerated their adoption nationwide. It also prompted a cultural reckoning with issues like social isolation among teens, mental health support in schools, access to firearms by minors, digital culture, and online radicalization. For many Americans who were in school at the time, Columbine became a defining event. It was the first moment when school violence felt not only possible, but real and near. Students from that era still recall where they were when they heard the news. Teachers remember how it changed their role from educator to protector. Parents began asking different questions about school environments and safety. And for the survivors, families of victims, and first responders, the story never really ended. It evolved from a tragedy into a mission to prevent future violence. The Columbine High School shooting was more than a tragedy. It was a turning point. In just under an hour, 2 students shattered the sense of safety that schools had long represented for American families. And while it was not the first act of school violence in the U.S., its scale, planning, and aftermath forced a nation to confront hard truths about security, mental health, gun access, and how we respond to those in crisis. In the years since 1999, nearly every aspect of school life has changed in response. Security measures are now standard, from cameras to locked entrances to active shooter drills. Mental health services have expanded, though still unevenly across the country. Law enforcement tactics have evolved, prioritizing fast intervention and threat prevention. And the debate over gun laws remains one of the most polarizing and persistent issues in American society. But perhaps the most important legacy of Columbine is this: it sparked a conversation that has never truly ended. Each time another school shooting makes headlines, the memory of Columbine resurfaces, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder that the questions raised in 1999 are still with us. How do we keep students safe? What warning signs are we missing? What are we willing to change to stop this from happening again? For survivors and families of victims, the mission has become personal. Many have dedicated their lives to advocacy, prevention, and education, working so that no other community has to endure what theirs did. Columbine changed America. It changed our schools, our policies, our awareness. And over 2 decades later, its lessons continue to shape how we prepare, respond, and most importantly, how we remember. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.